Hello everyone, today Harper, Ayushman, Lilly, and I are going to analyze Edgar Allan Poe's short horror story, The Masque of the Red Death. We are indeed going to be taking a journey through the Poescape to analyze his writing style, voice, and overall structure of a story. There are many intricacies and symbolisms within the text that we are going to dive right into and take a closer look at. So let's get started! Edgar Allan Poe was born in 1809 in Boston, Massachusetts. He was orphaned at the young age of 2. His mother was a beautiful actress, and she died from tuberculosis, which at the time was called consumption. She was on her deathbed backstage during a tour production of Romeo and Juliet. He was taken in by the Allens in Richmond, Virginia. They were a rich couple, and Frances was very kind to him, but her husband despised him and would not adopt Edgar. He ended up falling in love with their young daughter Virginia when she was only 13 years old. Frances also ended up dying of consumption. He became obsessed with the deaths of beautiful young women, especially after Virginia eventually passed from consumption as well. The Masque was written while she was dying. The Red Death is inspired by tuberculosis. The story parallels Virginia's struggle against death and her final inability to escape. The main idea of the story is not the death of a young woman, but rather the idea of death's imminence, like a plague or a disease that cannot be cured. The Red Death is a disease that involves blood coming from the pores, which kills the victim within a half hour. Sound vaguely familiar? It is similar to consumption, which killed many of Poe's most beloved people in his life, drowning in the blood that fills the lungs when one has the condition. Poe developed an interest in the macabre and the perverse, and because of his stepfather, foster father, whatever you want to call him, ended up having disdain for figures of authority as well, and that is reflected in the short story. It is a horror story written in 1842, and it builds on the aspects of death within his other poems and stories as well. It contains criticism of the nobility and authority doing nothing to help the citizens, technically under their protection, and that may be an allegory to Poe's foster dad, Frances's husband, who always detested him because he was a wealthy man who didn't really care much about anything but himself. Poe speaks through this story about his experiences with family, friends, and personal adversaries, and the emotions he dealt with during these times. Poe was very destitute and unsuccessful his entire life, which contributes to his apparent loathing of wealthy nobility in this tale. The ebony clock, a major motif in the story, represents the passing of time and the inevitability of death. Just like Poe's own life, he watched his loved ones die and couldn't stop it, like his mother. Freytag's Pyramid. So we're going to go through the main plot points in the story, starting with the exposition. The exposition of The Masque of the Red Death is very unusually long because, we'll touch on this later in a video that focuses more on Poe's writing style and the way he writes each short story, but he includes a lot of description in the first couple paragraphs of the story, which makes the exposition much, much longer than the rest of the story. So we have a very long, drawn-out exposition and a short rising action, short climax, short falling actions, and so on. So in the exposition, we start off with the disease itself being described, and how it is the reason why Prince Prospero and the nobles hide in their extravagant abbey to escape the Red Death, because the disease is spreading rapidly outside of the abbey. It's just ravaging the towns, killing everyone. So, of course, naturally, they decide to throw a ball. And each room, each color is described by the narrator in great detail as to Poe's style. The inciting incident, right by the red star here, is when the ebony clock chimes and everybody in the abbey freezes because they are reminded that they cannot run from death forever. The rising action is when the stranger shows up at the masquerade ball dressed in his dirty red clothing, and the nobles are terrified. They're all like, who's this guy? Like, what's going on here? No one knows who he is. The climax is when Prospero conjures up the courage to confront the Red Death, accusing him of mockery and blasphemy, because he thinks he's a masquerader, making fun of the epidemic, dressing in this red corpse-like outfit. Prospero, foolish as ever, attempts to murder the stranger and dies. The guests are enraged at his death, they charge him, realizing his true identity. The stranger is the Red Death. The resolution is when everyone in the abbey dies and the Red Death conquers all and death is inevitable. And they all live happily ever after, I guess. In the first image, we have here a chunk of the exposition. It's the first paragraph. It's where the narrator sets the scene and describes the reason for the noble's hiding, the Red Death epidemic, describes the disease itself, and just kind of like tells the readers what's going on in the setting. In the second image, there's a chunk of the climax where Prospero bravely confronts the masked stranger at his ball, believing him to be a masquerader, dressed in a mockery of the horrendous disease. And the third image is the resolution, when the reader realizes that the stranger is the Red Death, and all the masqueraders die at its feet. The last sentence insinuates that death is inevitable, which is a huge theme in the story, but we will talk more on that later. There is actually a lot of irony in the story for it being such a dark, macabre mood. So a big chunk of irony, situational and dramatic, is when the castle that is meant to protect them becomes their grave. It's situational irony because the unsuspecting characters thought that they were safe in the abbey, when in reality it was, of course, not safe because death is inevitable. It is also dramatic irony because they did not fully know that they were unsafe in the abbey. It was known to the readers because of the omniscient narrator explaining it to them. The true devastation and power of the Red Death was not understood by the foolish nobles, but was understood by those who read the story because the narrator was telling us everything. Prospero tried to escape death by isolating himself in his castle and ultimately succumbed to the disease he was trying to avoid, demonstrating the futility of his actions, which is ironic in itself. Another example of dramatic irony is when the guests believe they are safe, but the Red Death is already among them. They were distracted by the extravagance and the ball inside the abbey and didn't even realize how close death truly was. There are a lot of examples of literary techniques in the story. I'm going to briefly touch on a few of them, so it should be that major part of your haze board. The ebony clock is a major motif in the story. Its ticking foreshadows the death of all the nobility, like a countdown. Despite their efforts, the clock of time simply ticks on as it does not bend to mortal whims. Just as time ticks on, one's lifespan is ever decreasing, just as a fact of life. The entire description of the guest, who turns out to be the physical embodiment of death itself, creates a familiar air of mystery, often found within Poe's writing, tying it back to the rest of the author's writing and style, which will be discussed in more detail during a later video, so hold tight. The pacing in the story slows immensely when the clock chimes. The guests all freeze, and for a moment, all is still. The party picks back up after it is over, but Poe writes that every time the clock hits the hour, the guests react in that same way, scared, frozen, and silent. The clock also provides an air of suspense because the chimes are ominous and remind the guests of their imminent demise. Sound description adds to this by immersing the reader in the emptiness that fills the air surrounding the clock sounds, furthering to suspense and tension experienced by the characters in this momentary pause. Rich sensory details like this, which Poe loves to use in all of his stories, also including the detailed colors of the rooms and the visual imagery of the masked figure himself, makes the story feel immersive and real, applying verisimilitude. The entire party's premise seems artificial, however. The nobles do not seem truly happy, especially since they are reminded of their doom every hour. Their futile attempts to forget the Red Death affects their mannerisms and make them not truly enjoying themselves. In the back of their minds, they're just thinking about their imminent death, which they're not even totally sure is happening, but is still there because in darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. Now, to finish off this video, I want to talk briefly about the characters and the conflict. So the protagonist of the story, I'm sure you can guess, is Prince Prospero. As foolish as he may be and unlikable to the reader, he is still technically the good guy in the story. The antagonist is the Red Death. So a few examples of conflict in the story include man versus nature, where Prince Prospero and the nobles think they can avoid death, but they are confronted by it at the masquerade ball. Man versus society, where the Red Death also criticizes the nobles for being frivolous and indulging in a lavish party, while everyone outside of the abbey is suffering and dying from the fatal plague. Man versus fate is also at play in the story, where Prospero believes he can avoid death by hiding in his castle, but in the end, the Red Death still finds him, proving that no one can escape their fate, which in this case is death. And of course, one of the main conflicts is man versus man, man, quotation marks. The Red Death is technically a man in this story, which is Prospero versus the Red Death. And, I think we all know how that plays out. One of the main focuses of this novel is how a lack of empathy or a sense of humility, dying is quite humble in comparison to living in luxury forever, can play out in the ruling class of society, and it serves as a root of tension and conflict between the Red Death and Prince Prospero. This further establishes the hidden imperfections within the society and how nobody is really secure, despite how picture-perfect and beautiful a society may be. There is always something or someone that can sabotage that superficial beauty. Alright, so that concludes this video. The next video will dive deeper into the nature of each character with a brilliant analysis by my classmate Ayushman. So stay tuned for The Masque of the Red Death Part 2.